Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of our live studio audience, our viewing audience via NTN, National Television Network, those of you joining us online via Facebook, esteemed panelists, members of the media, invited guests. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for what promises to be a spirited discussion about communication and its role in fueling economic growth. More specifically, today's topic asserts that a well-coordinated, strategized, and funded national information communication roadmap is vital to economic growth. Today's forum is one in a series of events by the National Productivity Council to commemorate this year's Productivity Awareness Week. My name is Onel Sanford Bell, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. In the past 18 months or so, the world over has seen and felt the salience of communication. Communication between individuals, between businesses and their consumers, between public bodies and the general population they serve, all relied on communication messaging to protect health, save lives, and sustain us with food and other essentials like toilet paper during those lockdown periods. A recent report by the UK government's COVID-19 Communications Advisory Panel found that the communication function of organizations, private and public, catapulted to the top of the agenda as an executive management role within leadership teams during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is likely to remain at the top of agendas in the 21st century world. Our objective today is to facilitate a rich dialogue around the communication function in our local context here in St. Lucia, where we've placed communication in our organizations, how we utilize it, how to strengthen it, and how communication is strategically linked to economic growth. Guiding us through today's discussion is a panel of esteemed communication professionals whom I have the pleasure of introducing to you. To my immediate left, we have Mr. Embert Charles. He is an experienced development communication specialist with expertise in electronic communications, media policy, and regulations. He has held senior managerial and leadership positions in the region, including Managing Director of the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Regulatory Authority, ECTEL, and a Communications and Public Awareness Consultant for the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS. He served previously as Executive Director of the Folk Research Center and Director of Information Services with the Government of St. Lucia. Embert Charles has over 4 decades of engagement with Caribbean grassroots organizations in the areas of nation, language, and culture, community empowerment, communications, and sustainable development. Organization memberships include the Monsignor Patrick Anthony Folk Research Center, the St. Lucia National Trust, and the World Association for Christian Communications. His published works focus on communications, telecommunications, media development, and culture. He holds a master's degree in telecommunications regulation and policy from the University of the West Indies and an MPhil in development studies from the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. To my extreme right, we have Ms. Natalie Jolie-Fanis. She is the Senior Communications Officer in the newly formed Marketing and Communications Unit at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, where she has been employed for the last 15 years. She's a trained teacher and has been an educator for over 20 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in mass communication and a master's in training and development. To my immediate right is Mr. Richmond Felix, an ICT specialist with broad experience and in-depth working knowledge of the public sector, regional integration initiatives, knowledge management, information and communication technology, and the broadcasting and media landscape in the OECS and CARICOM. And to my extreme left is Miss Loverly Anthony. She is a marketing strategist and a development communications specialist. She currently serves as the acting head of communications at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS Commission. Her present scope of work involves leading a smart advocacy agenda for regional and international brand promotion to boost the brand value and visibility of the organization and to promote the OECS Economic Union. Over the past 5 years, she led the development and implementation of an OECS statistical communication and advocacy strategy that has supported several OECS member states' national statistics departments in advancing their communications agenda and public visibility. She holds a Master of Science degree in International Marketing Strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, our panelists. So now that our panelists have been introduced and I've described what they do professionally, it's time to hear from them. Let's hear in their own words how they work to deliver communication that is meaningful and relevant. Starting it off today with Miss Anthony, who is at the OECS Commission. In a nutshell, how do you interpret your role as head of communications at the OECS Commission, Miss Anthony?
Thank you, Nell. Let me first take the opportunity to congratulate the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council on the rollout of this week's engaging sessions. To answer your question, I see my role as head of communications at the OECS Commission as being accountable for and working with a dynamic team of communication specialists to develop and implement an effective communication strategy to support the vision of regional integration within the OECS and to project the values of the Commission, that is the intergovernmental organization created to action regional integration. As you would appreciate at the OECS, the scope of our support and programming for member states is wide. From economic development, which includes tourism and agriculture support, trade, support to social development, that's supporting health, education, youth development, and also in environmental sustainability as we take on joint action on climate change, etc. So for me, this means to first connect with the people of the region, hear and listen to the voices of the people, and then to speak to the people to address these issues about how we can move together as one region for sustainable progress. This also includes working closely with technical teams, implementing supporting initiatives to ensure that our program responds to the people. Internally, this also involves leading a dynamic team of experts in digital marketing, in media intelligence, content creation, data visualization, graphic design, management of events and production to bring out critical messages that can positively impact the lives of people of the OECS by informing them of regional activities and programs so that they can benefit, as well as engaging them in regional policy discourse so that their voices can be heard on raising their, and also to raise the awareness of regional integration and how it benefits them in their everyday lives.
Wonderful. So broad-ranging, and it really speaks to the broad mandate of a communication specialist, having to have some knowledge of all these areas of expertise to be able to effectively create messaging to meet these audiences. To my immediate right, we have Natalie, who has just joined who is with the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College and is now part of the newly formed Marketing and Communications Unit. What would you say is the central tenets of the function of your role?
Good afternoon, Onel. Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone listening. It is a pleasure to be here to participate in this conversation. So you started off, Onel, by saying that COVID catapulted communications to the top of the top priority in many organizations. And I would say at Sir Arthur Lewis, it probably did that just a little before COVID, where before we did not have a unit dedicated to communications and to marketing, and that's why we say it's newly formed. So the unit and myself, we are really there to assist the college with fulfilling its mandate, the education and training of our citizenry that we take very, very seriously. And in the last 2 years, we are functioning on the new pillars of sustainability, innovation, and entrepreneurship, which we have integrated into all of our program offerings. So we are really keen on sustained engagement with our SALCC community, our students, our staff, and also our external stakeholders that play a key role in the delivery of our programs and in also sustaining the relationship we have with the society. So we are also responsible for promoting the SALCC brand, which went under some changes as well recently. Those who have seen the logo would notice that we are embracing the image of Sir Arthur Lewis as well as his name, giving his prominence, his importance, his contribution internationally. And we are also keen on diversifying our student body. So our outreach now goes beyond just St. Lucia, which used to be our primary target audience, into the diaspora and the OACS as well. So in the last couple of years, we have been able to improve our reach and our presence in the society, and also at least regionally and internationally. So we have increased visibility. We have been able to double our social media following, and we are working towards reaching out especially to the youth, our young people, especially in this COVID period. We're playing a key role in keeping them engaged in as many diverse ways as we can.
Wonderful. Mr. Ember Charles, we have to my left, immediate left, Mr. Ember Charles, who is a development communication consultant. Help us to understand what a development communication consultant is concerned with. What is it that you really do for organizations?
Thank you very much, O'Neill, and good afternoon, or good day, or good evening to everyone and the fellow panelists. I think we have to start with an understanding of what is development communication. And to understand it, you have to juxtapose it against what is traditional communication. I recall my professor at UWI, Professor Agri Brown, bless his soul, always said that the role of the media in our current capitalist system is to deliver audiences to advertisers. Development communication seeks to turn this on its head. In other words, you try to find out what information does the audience need, and that you work to ensure that they get that information for their social development. So it's about positive impact on people, on audiences, and on societies, which assumes that you have to understand two things. One, their tools of communication, which includes their language, their circumstances as well, and some of the constraints under which they consume that information. So you must understand people's culture, their language, but you must also understand the modern tools that are available to them and how best these tools can work with the traditional tools that they have to get effective messages across to them to have a positive impact on their lives. So because of that, you find you're basically doomed to be working with a lot of organizations which have very little resources, but trying to ensure that the messages get to grassroots communities and so forth. Ironically, and perhaps fortunately for me, I also worked on the other end as a regulator in the telecom sector. And because of that, I have been taken up with a lot of issues related to consumers, and they need to ensure that they have good quality service coming from the telecom service providers, because a lot of our systems, our productivity networks, even some of our regulatory arrangements are really stacked in favor of producers and production. And like the issues of productivity in society, you find there are many issues related to distribution of these messages, distribution of services, and distribution of good quality services. So from that development perspective, one is able to clinically analyze the issues and provide some, hopefully, workable solutions to addressing these problems.
So I'm hearing that there's a deficit in the distribution of our messaging.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, perhaps our ICT specialist can help us to understand what that deficit is and how it might be addressed. Tell us a little about your work in the OECS and CARICOM Richmond.
Okay, so my experience has spanned both the ICT strata and the media strata and broadcasting. And during that time, a little over 25 years, imagine that, I've been able to interface with people in terms of the information dissemination part of that. But what do you do when now you've received a message? Many times there is a call to act, a call to respond. But people ask, how can I do exactly that? And given the current developments around the world, we really have to recognize how we can move from just consumption of information and those messages to leveraging it for our sustainable development, as Imba just said a while ago. And this is what we really have, because in our region, there is a big scarcity of natural resources. But what we really have to offer the world and to depend on is the power of our minds, our imagination. And we have shown through Nobel laureates, especially in St. Lucia, that we have so much to offer the world in all of those fields. So it's really to move beyond just consuming data, passively receiving those messages, but leveraging what is there and what provides a level playing field for all of us in the world. Because all of the products that we consume, and you know what is the biggest things now is social media, but we have to find, and going off the theme of productivity and competitiveness this week, innovative ways, creative ways to do that. And my special area is really knowledge management, which is the collection of methods relating to creating, sharing, and using data and information to leverage that competitive advantage. And in some of that, I would say we leverage public sector institutions which have a lot of data, some of it in not a very accessible mode, but it is there. There are countless studies that fill a whole library, and we must tap into those things to analyze, to do the data mining, and to inform exactly. And as we now see, listening to the science, but using it now to move forward and not doing it in a reactionary way, but very proactive in order for us to reap our little piece of the oyster that the world is.
Interesting that you should say so, because I'd like to share a quote from Mandy Pierce, President-elect from the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in the UK, who also noted that overall what we need is to create a generation of PRs, public relation professionals, who understand numbers, analytics, and statistics, and can then translate that into insight to drive effective communication strategies. So I think we do have to catch up to, as you say, to level the playing field, right? Because we would have to be communicating with this kind of language as well. Now, going back to the deficit pointed out by Embert, do you understand this deficit?
Oh, very well.
Help us, share with us.
Very well. And this deficit is shown especially as we currently confront what is the elephant in the world right now of the pandemic, where the seeds of disinformation and misinformation are showing the biggest negative part of it, that people will choose to believe a lot of this disinformation, and again, it shows that there is a desire to do some level of research and information gathering and knowledge finding, yes, but you must have some standard means of deciding what references that you have. And if a reference is sound enough, it will go through all of the trials against that there. So I am not going to start by counting any information source out, but it must be systematic, and our people must find those ways of doing it. Because we talk about all of this new wave of information and new media, etc., but the fundamentals of knowledge gathering, of learning remain. That is the one constant that I would say that you need to marry these new tools with, and that is where the deficit is our ability at all levels, because the younger ones are coming up with that being their reality, and the older ones are finding themselves somewhat overwhelmed by, I have not learned how to do it. But I would just say that we don't think too much when we take up a pen and we write. What is handwriting or handcrafting? It's the same way when you use a keyboard or a computer, that it should be natural, and we must find ways to make that as natural as possible and not get too much hung up on the technology and the ones and zeros.
Right. Before we move on from that point about deficit, because I think I want us to be very clear about where it is. So I perhaps should give Embert another opportunity.
And I think I'm glad Richmond, I'm just sort of taking off from where Richmond is speaking, because I'm glad COVID is presented as an example, in that there's been a lot of talk about we need to understand the sciences to address the issue of COVID. But in this COVID debate, there are three sciences there. There's the science of medicine, which is what has dominated the discussion. There's the science of persuasion and the science of communication. And the two sciences have not been addressed at all. Just to give you a typical example, in most of the Caribbean countries, governments have attempted to approach the vaccination public relations by getting, the so-called prominent people, so-called influencers, to get the vaccines first. Hopefully, they're hoping they will influence others. But look at the profile of these influencers. Who are they influencing? Look at those who have refused to take the vaccine. Who are their influencers? We need to ask ourselves that. That's why I started with the premise that you need to, from a development communication perspective, who needs information and what type of information do they need? In that way, you're better able to get to them. We know all of us around the table have been professionally trained in communications, and we know face-to-face communication is perhaps the most effective in some regard. But because of the underinvestment in lots of these communication programs, you find there's a lot of unintended consequences of these campaigns, and sometimes they fail. So I think COVID is teaching us a lesson in many ways, apart from the productivity issues, which we'll come to a little later. But that issue of the deficit of information is coming up very, very strongly because of the approach we have taken to addressing the education of the public on the issue of vaccination in particular.
Exactly. So it's about cogent data collection, analysis, dissemination, and it would require the application of data and perhaps behavioral science when we are shaping communication responses. On our panel, we have someone who's had a lot of experience in statistical data management and perhaps dissemination. Help us to understand or share with us if you've been able to leverage that skill to assist with the messaging for COVID, especially at this time.
Okay, well, let me first say, Onel, that COVID has entirely changed the context of communication. We're dealing with a situation of great uncertainty because it is a new life-threatening virus spreading at a rapid rate. And the science, as we fight the virus, is evolving. So is the messaging. The things we thought were true may change as the understanding of the virus behavior evolves. However, that may not mean that the communicators are sharing untruths or they may not have the right data. The challenge, therefore, is how we manage the messaging and how we ensure that the messaging is not dogmatic but flexible. On the data side, Let me first say that when I hear the words data and communication, I get excited because for the last 6 years, I have been coordinating statistical communication in the region. And I clearly understand the urgency and the importance of communicating data and using data as a means of presenting factual angles and positions to allow for accountable and transparent public messaging. Also, communicating with data is also critical because it allows us to also educate the public, and we need to keep that perspective in mind. So the integration of data visualization tools like process or highlight infographics as communication products or as part of communication packaging should also be impactful and be considered for engagement of the public and in presenting clear messages, factual information and guidance. Because it is critical that in addressing the issues and putting forward the recommendations, that the data is clearly presented as part of the messaging to support these moves.
But who does this work? With a serious level of underinvestment, as Embert rightly point out, in the communication sector, in media, who does this work? Is it a challenge you've encountered at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, Natalie?
Definitely, and I hear the deficit that you speak of, and I sort of want to, when we speak of changes that are happening, as Lovely alluded to, with things evolving, and the messaging is not correct, I think a trust issue really comes to the fore, and I see that coming out in the pandemic. Why are people not accepting the information that is coming to them? So Richmond said they're moving towards disinformation, but that is a real issue that I think has to be addressed. Why aren't we trusting the science? What is it in the messaging that has brought that on? And it is a real issue because people are not responding. So the other thing for me in education, I think, that is the other deficit, is accessibility. I think that is what we are facing quite a bit. So we probably have the necessary communication that we need to bring over to our audience. But in this pandemic, where we have lost that face-to-face setting, and we need to reach our students, whether they are young people or our adult students, they need access, they need devices, they need connectivity. And to me, that is also an issue because we can't divorce that. If the messaging is there, but there's no way to bring it across, that is a real deficit, I think, for us in education that needs to be addressed as well.
Right. So I've always thought that there was a real dearth in data in the region. But what I'm hearing here this afternoon is that the data exists, but we just lack the skills, the skill set and the tools to analyze this data and present this data in a visually stimulating way for our audiences. So that's probably a noted area for professional development, maybe in our sector, as we look to scale up. But it's interesting that you should mention trust in our communications. In my research, I came across a trust barometer done by the Edelman firm, which is a communications firm in the UK. And this trust barometer shows that people trust businesses over NGOs and government and media. How did we get here? Embert? How did we get here? How do you trust a business over an NGO?
Well, I think we have to remember that trust leads to credibility, or vice versa. And as a communicator, credibility is so important. But in my own work and study, I think there are three key pillars of credibility. There's authority. Somebody will respect you because you're an authority on a particular matter. There's also expertise. It may not be the same because a chief medical officer may have authority by basis of a position, but not necessarily the expertise in a particular area. And of course, what is most important is experience. These three are the three pillars of credibility. Of course, there you can also add, in some cases, people speak about popularity. If the messenger is popular, that adds to the messenger's credibility. But we have seen in recent times, populist leaders are not necessarily the most credible leaders around the world. But it speaks to how long you have been doing something, and the receiver is seeing positive results from that. Now, most times, the private sector is usually highly resourced, especially mega corporations and big business, because when you speak about credibility and believability of the private sector, it's not every business that is at the same level. It's businesses who can afford to maintain that level of credibility because of the resources they have. On the other hand, the NGO sector is under-resourced, and the government sector presents a particularly different set of challenges in that, governments change every 5 years in our part of the world.
Right.
So they do not have the level of longevity that the private sector, especially the monopolies, would have in our space. And also, they have to grapple with a series of varying demands they have to balance, as opposed to the private sector, whose primary demand is ensuring that it delivers its goods and services and provides a returns on the investments to its investors.
So they have more at stake to deliver on the brand promise.
They have more at stake, and they have the resources also to deliver.
Right, and so they are more inclined to deliver
yeah.
because the consequences are there.
Yeah, and of course you have to ask yourself, who developed that barometer in the first place?
Well, I suppose I should have prefaced my question by asking you if you find the barometer credulous.
Well, I would have to sort of go in depth into trying to figure out where it came from. I mean, on the
Well,
surface
it's
of it, I wouldn't be able to just make a
It's a
comment.
well-known communications firm. Yes. So they claim that this survey was carried out in 27 countries, and in 18 of the 27 countries, people rated businesses more favorably in the trust barometer than they did. In fact, 61%, and it was up by 2%, by 2 points. NGOs came in at 57%, down by 1 point. So it's a downward position there. Governments went up 3 points to 53%, and media rose 2 points, up now to 51%. Richie, you worked in the media.
Yes.
Help us to understand why people have difficulty trusting the media as their primary source of information.
Well, that part of your reference I found rather interesting, because the media has for some time been known as the fourth estate. Traditionally they were three estates, but the media has been thrown forward as the fourth estate, and as a long time as a watcher of what is happening in society, what is happening in the world. So I would like to definitely look at that study a little bit deeper. But it's ironic because I think part of that probably has to do with the agenda of media houses, especially in the Western side, is pushed because of the owners, those very businesses that people seem to be trusting more. Some of the distrust, again, with the pandemic has to do with the business agenda as well, in terms of why one solution or one remedy is being pushed and others are not, whether they be natural or otherwise. So I find it interesting that this study has it in that order. I would have factored, and my bias is there, I would like to declare that I still think that the media has a fundamental role in terms of bona fide media organizations to sift through the facts, do all of the data mining and investigation, find the real stories that are there, especially those that are untold or those that are pushed down because of the agenda of businesses, NGOs, governments, etc. So, but I think too that some of us are to blame because when it is convenient, we would cite a media source, and people are very quick to forward a message that they have not even double check or cross reference.
So I was wondering as you were speaking, you know, to what extent is social media undermining the credibility of traditional media, and perhaps Natalie can share some thoughts on that.
Sure. Before I answer that question, though, unlike Embert and Richmond, I don't find the statistics are that unusual, that people are trusting business more than government. Because like he says, business has an agenda.
Business more than government, I can understand.
Business more than businesses.
Media is my.
Like you say, they have an agenda.
Yeah. Okay.
So they do a lot more research on what their customers want and their responses. They get feedback, which is something that is not done. When we talk about national policy, how much information does governmental agencies receive from people on the impact of their policies, etc.? But businesses do that. Only this morning somebody said to me something about a sentiment analysis that is now being done by businesses. So they're going into the social, yeah? So they're not just using raw data or statistics or the quantitative, they're also using the qualitative. And if they are responding to their customers, then maybe that's why there's a trust factor there as compared to government. But if I can take this back to just the social media and bring in education, Sir Arthur Lewis is now actually doing a lot on digital literacy, ethics, where it involves. So we don't even understand when we go online what it is that we do. When we do a search for ourselves, what can come up? So we've actually instituted a class that can teach our students about their presence online, about what they're exposing themselves to, about getting what is bona fide information. So that is a role of education, and we need to do more of that, because social media almost came upon us without us being schooled into how to use it, because it's just readily available. But it is something that we need to educate our populace on how to use, how to dissect. So when we were doing research at school, Emma, you knew what was scholarly versus, I don't know, just like a .com versus a .edu, etc. Yes. And we were schooled in that kind of research. That has not been done for social media.
Right. And stick a pin there. I do want to come back to social media, disinformation, fake news, misinformation. But let's get Loverly's thoughts on the trust issue. How did you find the report?
Okay, well, I'm not too clear on the report because I haven't seen the report. But what I would like to say on the trust issue is that as it relates to government and public policy and the engagement in the process of developing public policy that the people will trust, a relationship the relationship that has to be developed between government and the media is necessary from the inception of the development of the policy. And I think when the public is engaged in developing a policy or they're consulted in the process, it is then easier for them to trust and support the implementation of the policy. For example, in the reform of the public service, there's no better guide than the voices and the views of the people whom the public service serves. In terms of the internet and how it affects that process, the internet presents several avenues to allow for the engagement and the collection of feedback from the public on policy issues. For example, crowdsourcing tools can be used to promote and collate feedback. Also, social media is one of the most effective ways to gauge the public pulse and temperature on issues that can instruct communication messaging. So paying attention to the informal social media feedback regarding the issues, that is very, very essential in the public.
But how good are we at doing that in these parts, especially from a governmental standpoint? Do we really monitor social media from the point of view of engaging in rapid responses, receiving feedback and actually interpreting them in a meaningful way? Maybe Embert, you can take that.
Well, we have to remember, perhaps Richmond could bear with me on this one. The internet is really the Wild West. The internet has no rules. There are certain rules in terms of connectivity and so forth. But people have fought hard to protect that freedom of the internet. So we have to bear that in mind when we try to ascribe a lot of these certain qualities to the internet. One is not suggesting by any means that there's no value in using the internet, information goes out, but we also have to set it against certain issues of ethics, I think someone spoke about. The fact that the internet itself is galloping at a pace way beyond our capabilities to manage that relationship with the internet. We know of all the issues around the world that the big techs are facing now in terms of countries trying to clamp down on them and regulate them and so forth, and how hard they are fighting, because by and large it has become a cash cow which nobody will want to give up. So it has its good and its bad, and it's for us to manage what is there for us as best as possible and to utilize it to our advantage.
But certainly it is demanding more of a two-way communication, and especially in our Caribbean context, we're so used to the one-way communication style.
Particularly
We issue a press release, and the media carries the press release verbatim. Right? There is no verification. There is no, fact checking. Whatever is said in that press release, that's what makes the newscast. In addition to that, we respond. We're very responsive. We're not
reactionary.
Proactive. Yes,
Yes.
very
Yes.
not responsive.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, reactionary. We react. So something happens, we react. Sometimes I can actually predict the headline for tomorrow, especially in the.
But
in
herein
the-
lies
in
the
political-
dichotomy, O'Neill, because at a very traditional level, our communication methods have always been call and response.
Call and response.
Communication has always been total.
Right.
You walk away when you understood an instruction, whether verbally or non-verbally, you're able to interact with that instruction. But at the level of the formal media, because of issues of economy, that you have to ensure you multiply your messages to get so many people at the same time,
Right.
then you can't be bothered with these sort of call and response. So it's just, as you would see in things, the needle just being injected into you, you get the drug and you move on.
Right. But what COVID showed us is that we needed to change that, because there was really nothing to react to. What we needed, what the public needed, was the instructing messaging and the adjusting messaging. And we certainly did not have the experience to do that with the agility that the situation demanded. How did you think we handled the COVID crisis from a communication standpoint? I know Embert spoke about the challenges with the vaccination effort, but before we got to the vaccination, we had a pandemic, we had lockdowns, and there was everybody was starving for information, basically, waiting for the instruction, waiting to hear when we can go out, what we can do. Like I said, the instructing and adjusting messaging. How did we do in those early stages?
Well, again, I think from the early stages, it has shown that in these past 2 years and going now, that there was nothing much that we could have done proactively, because look at what our neighbors, even right around the world, have been struggling with. But it has shown one thing, that what you knew yesterday is not what you knew today. And somebody said it a little earlier during this discussion, and it might not necessarily be what we consider the truth tomorrow, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think where we have dropped the ball a bit is from who the messages come from and the timing of messages, because it's not just using communication techniques and And as we've studied communication, I remember when I studied communication at Carimac, it was changing from mass communication to media and communication.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what it is called today, because it cannot be media and communication anymore. It has to deal with, as Lovely said, the data part of it and analysis of it, and engagement, which is what social media pushes, that it is not just disseminating a message and dropping it into the water there, but seeing how it is assimilated and reacting to it. And what you had started with is, we have to accept, might be going in a certain direction that you now realize, oh boy, maybe we need to make these adjustments, and be frank with ourselves, confront the data, look at it, and make the requisite adjustment. And on the other side of it, it might be, aha, it's actually taking better routes, and as we work with our publics there, the effect that we had anticipated is even better. And I think that is what is lacking. Who is it coming from? The timing of it, and how to tweak and engage the audiences in a very frank and honest and real way.
So more human communication.
Yes.
More human communication.
If I can piggyback on Richmond as well, I think we have to admit, even as communication specialists, that the communication landscape is a lot more complex than probably when we just began. We began, I think, in the absence of social media, not disclosing our ages or anything, and possibly, for the most part, we were setting the agenda. Yes, people took their cues mainly from broadcast media, which was dominant at the time. But we are no longer doing that. If we look at the Arab Springs, what happened in Hong Kong, it can come from the grassroots as well. So, and I think with government and possibly even with specialists, we are sort of chasing after. We are not ahead of the game, and we have a hard time catching up and really getting that messaging out there, because there are so many people now who are experts.
Well, we weren't on the front foot going in.
Yes,
Pre-pandemic, we weren't on the front foot
That's
because we are reactionary,
Yeah.
as we've concluded.
But even in the communication landscape, because of the introduction of social media, I think that too has posed the challenge. And that is why we're not setting the agenda, because now anybody can set the agenda, as compared to when you had an authority in control of the message.
Right.
Yeah,
Everybody's now a publisher. Right. So social media is no doubt an effective platform for the dissemination of information, especially in this health crisis. And so there's some benefits there, but it also came with the challenge of fake news, disinformation, misinformation. And some experts have said that we have the pandemic here, that the health professionals are battling. And then on the other hand, you have the infodemic, information anarchy, all sorts of descriptions that are triggering infobesity.
Wow.
That the communications practitioners are now battling. Help us to understand how you navigated, this information landscape at the OECS Loverly, especially since you have so many stakeholders, and the OECS was involved in mobilizing resources to help us through this pandemic.
Oh, now I think I will piggyback on an initiative that we engaged in during the COVID-19 breakout last year. In the OECS, we recently established a GIS network that includes representation from across the OECS Government Information Service and all the OECS institutions. And the intention is to facilitate increased efficiency and effectiveness in communication via joint coverage. And so in the COVID landscape, what was to keep the National Information Service up to date on OECS communication activities, especially regarding COVID as well, and to exchange ideas and approaches and inform on best practices to engage in and promoting national activities and national initiatives, and to harmonize strategies across the board. We also undertook some joint coverage of regional activities. We are hoping that this, in the long run, may also extend to further collaboration, but this collaborative approach of intergovernmental communication in the region allows us to reinforce our messaging jointly, especially on cross-cutting issues like COVID-19, water down the political divide on these issues, extend our individual audiences, create some efficiencies, and allow for uniformity of voice. Besides what we are doing at the level of the state, the synergies we want to create for people empowerment, so that the voices of the marginalized, the voices of the vulnerable, and the voices of women, men, the voices of the youth find expression through the messages that we communicate in. In that way, we make the people not just passengers on the regional integration bus, or the fighting the COVID transport, but shapers of regional integration.
But this assumes that you have a captive audience. But in reality, we know that that is a very crowded space. The information landscape is a very crowded space. So how then do you differentiate your messaging and connect with the audiences that you're trying to reach amidst this infodemic?
I want to bounce back on something that Richmond said earlier, engagement. With regards to the COVID-19 crisis, again, that has currently presented itself, it has left many lessons. And one of them is, engagement. A reactive approach during a crisis is definitely non-strategic.
Right.
What is most important, however, is understanding the perceptions and concerns of the stakeholders or the publics on the issues, and enabling them to speak out. Then crafting messages and campaigns that are responsive to these questions and concerns of the public. So for example, with COVID-19, when one reviews comments online, you would find a lot of myths about the vaccine, myths about how COVID-19 may have come about. It is important, however, to ensure that content is created to target these myths and provide factual information, and make that information available to the public, and to do so from many angles and at many levels, so that everyone at varying stages of understanding in the public can connect to the message. So it really boils down to engagement.
Engagement, and I take the point of engagement, but going back to an earlier point made by Embert, we're doing this with limited resources, and the misinformation, the disinformation is coming at us at a fast pace. It is being produced by people who are sitting at their dining room tables and their bedrooms. So what are some of the strategies, Embert, as a development consultant, what are some of the strategies that communication professionals can arm themselves with to help combat disinformation, misinformation, and fake news in a realistic way, considering that the internet, as you said, is a wild, wild west?
Well, O'Neill, we have to go back to basics. Any serious media person has to understand the veracity of its source of information and its credibility of the source of information. Richmond made reference earlier to the point that you just don't pull down something without double checking. And
hello, everybody.
Certainly,
This is what we're going to need.
social media is so all over the place, and we as media professionals, especially those who are in media entities that are responsible for disseminating information, must realize we are also mediators in that regard. We bring our own biases to what we carry, because we may choose some social media sources we think that are credible, and we dump some others. But I think we have to go back to the fundamental principle of verifying the information, so the information comes across as authoritative. The day that you become challenged with that perspective, and some of your information is deemed to be non-credible and false, then you are on the road, on the slide downwards. And clearly you may as well jump off the bus and go to do something else, because you'll be doing more damage in the long run than any good.
Right. So this brings me to the point of communication in managing reputation. Some feedback from our
Social media.
Yes.
From the
Yes.
Zoom room, yes.
Apologies for that. I'm not sure if our audience got that feedback. But as we were saying, this now brings us to the point of reputation management as it pertains to communication.
But even before you go across to that point, it's just coming across the table, the points that were made, Lovely's point on empowerment is really key to that, and I think it's really engagement, and it would lead to that. Because we have to realize that, as your study shows, people probably trust the businesses more than government. Because guess what? The businesses know more about you than sometimes you even know about yourself, based on the techniques that they leverage. You use a frequent buyer card all the time, whether to buy gas or at the supermarket, and you never think that you know those businesses know your diet better than you, what you pump in. They know what you're going to eat next week, and they provide in a very proactive way how they stock up for that. And I think governments should learn from that. And in the better part of it, because we saw recently how Facebook is now being looked upon yet again. There were hearings with Congress, etc., last week on how we tend to emphasize the bad news, the negative news, because Facebook has seen that people react to that more than a positive message. You're going to come with a positive message about strengthening your immune system and dealing with the times that we are, and maybe all well meaning you might lose out, but you come out with it has now been found X amount of side effects on that. People jump to that. So recognizing the human nature in that, and I say that to say that governments traditionally tend to lean into regulating, breaking up, and control, rather than engage, understand, and adapt.
But that they must, because they serve publics.
Yeah.
Publics that are willing to go and exercise their franchise every 5 years in these parts. Publics that they rely on to support initiatives such as the vaccine drives. So they can no longer take that position. They have to now learn to be a little more on the front foot to say, this is what we're trying to do, this is how we're doing it, and this is what is going to benefit you. So going back to social media and how we can utilize social media, would you say, and this is open to any member of the panel, would you say social media is more on the tactical side or the strategic side in our work as communicators? Bert, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think one has to be more strategic how one uses social media, because I mean, bearing in mind that in a competitive environment, most media compete with each other, and there's the issue of sensationalism in selling messages, as I said earlier, delivering audiences to advertisers, and the more sexy and salacious you are in some regard, is the more based on you sort of working on that premise that I think Richmond mentioned earlier, that people would go for the sort of false sensational messages as opposed to the true messages. I mean, having established that is one of the constraints, then I think the media enterprises, starting with the media management, has to decide strategically how you utilize social media, both in terms of as a source of information and as a distribution mechanism. Because clearly it has tremendous advantages and potential for the distribution of the message.
Right. And is it tactical or strategic for the SALCC?
I think for SALCC it is strategic as well. And we have to remember that we are an educational institution, and I have to go back in responding to the points that were made earlier, that we think it is important for us to build individuals who are digitally literate and who understand information. We're taking it for granted that people know how to do that, particularly with the landscape that we're faced with. So educating people about how to sift through that information that they are faced with is very, very important. And that's in response earlier to the point that Embert and Richmond were making. But right now, for us to be able to reach our target groups, that is where they are, on social media. It's hard to reach them anywhere else. So we are very strategic in our use of social media. So even with the challenges they present, so we even talk about how people respond on those platforms. So we've had to learn how to use tools, and I think we saw it at the opening of school. We dealt with it last year, where students essentially hijacked a Zoom meeting. So so you really do have to be strategic with the way that you use those platforms, with your messaging on these platforms, with your timing of your messages on these platforms. All of these things become really, really instrumental in actually getting your message out and reaching that audience that you want to.
Yes. And for you, Loverly, the OECS, is it strategic or tactical?
I would say it depends. It depends on the priority and the objective at the time. It could be tactical at times and strategic at times. But in extension to what Ms. Fanny said earlier, I want to twist this a bit and ask a question. For us at the OECS, because we don't deal with just the youth as our target audience, the question really is the population really online? I mean, prior to and even now within the COVID-19 context, life has been forced to pivot online because the lockdown has made everyday transactions online a must. And so it's basically sometimes impossible to complete a transaction if you cannot do it online. So over time, communications has mimicked that pivot and that shift to online, hence the popularity of social media. But because of the digital divide, which is not access to the technology divide, but an understanding and the use of the technology divide. Right. Significant sections of the population are sometimes marginalized and cut off from the conversation, from the message, from being engaged, because we're only online. So unfortunately, in that shift to online, we may be ignoring the power of traditional forms of communication. Radio, the ever-powerful Yodi in our own language. Yes, so this is why our approach to communication has to be realistic, balanced, and culturally appropriate. So urgent messages must be made in the language of the people and pitched to their level of cultural understanding. Sometimes that's outside of social media.
And that's a very, very good point. And thank you for sharing that. So communication has to be synergistic. Synergistic. It's not one or the other. It has to be all-encompassing. We have a question from a member of the audience.
I'm very happy for this
We'd
discussion.
like to invite his input.
Okay, Glenn Simon, National Competitiveness and Productivity Council. I'm very happy for the discussion, and it centers around data as well, and proper data management and use. But I want to go all the way back to our situation in St. Lucia. We're talking about a well-coordinated media landscape and roadmap in order to have proper economic growth. I haven't heard the economic growth aspect as yet. But we have in St. Lucia, I think, one of the largest number in terms of media houses, radio and television. Is it well coordinated at the moment? Is it that we are doing better than the other regional partners because of that fact? Or is it that we really are struggling to have a proper media framework that needs to be developed properly so that issues that have come up during COVID, like the misinformation, could have been better handled? I don't get a sense that we are well coordinated. There's a media association that has gone almost defunct, and that was one of the arms that was helping to bring some level of balance and structure, hopefully, if it works well. On the government side, I think we still have yet to enact the legislation, but we still have a proliferation of media, and they are not well organized in terms of what each one is expected to do, but everybody's trying to do the same thing and split that $1. What can be done better in order for us to have that proper roadmap that not just a COVID, but will allow us to fight off anything that comes after COVID? And we were in a hurricane belt that every year we stand ready for anything. But we have a lot of media. If there is a disaster, nearly all of them go down at the same time. What do we need to do to have a better coordinated environment so that we have this roadmap for success in our media and communications landscape?
Thank you so much,
It's not-
Glenn.
I guess anybody would be able to.
Yes, thank you so much. And you're quite right. You're quite right, because post-COVID, communication still underpins everything. So a communications roadmap or strategy is required. Was required before the pandemic, during the pandemic, became even more important during the pandemic, and certainly will be required post-pandemic. And as you mentioned, the proliferation of media, I recently looked into this, did some research, and I think there were 27 radio stations that hold frequency distribution licenses in St. Lucia in 2021, and about 12 television stations, 3 of which hold frequency distribution licenses. The others are operating through commercial agreements between Flow on cable TV. So you're quite right. So in this population of 200,000, we've got 1,000 television stations and 27 radio stations, perhaps 22 operating, but 27 with authorization to broadcast. So maybe, Richie, you can speak to the media landscape a bit. And
the media
regulation
landscape,
that is
but I'm also
absent.
hearing in Glenn's question, it speaks to, I see media as one part of any communications plan or strategy, and that the full responsibility is not just on the media. Because I think how we process information now, the media itself is informed by sources there. And the sources of that information must be there, and it must be of a high quality as well. So I do put some and great responsibility to the authorities, to the governments, to the other partners as well, to provide that information in a very timely manner, as sometimes people tend to be afraid of putting out the information because they think they will be called out. But with practice, you get better at it. And as you challenge yourself in that way, you put out greater quality of information.
But is there a need for some regulation of the sector?
But we must
which
always
I know is a very controversial
yes, I know.
issue because of freedom of
I'm
of
seeing my
expression
media
and
colleagues in
freedom
the
of-
room, Anya and Bernard,
Yes.
and I'm sure others are also observing. But we're not talking about, I hope, censorship of the media, because
Right.
then if you have that, especially in a healthy democracy, etc., where we live in, that is what we want. But regulation, maybe self-regulation, maybe regulation in terms of adoption of good standards and good practice. If that's what I'm hearing, yes, I fully endorse that, because you want to make sure that what you're getting is reliable. You can count on it. You can make decisions. You know, and that's the direction I would say. Clearly, too, if we have so many players in any industry, then it cannot stand and be sustainable for all of us in there. And maybe what we need to do is find other outlets in that, such as provision of data services, information, collating all of this information that is out there and making a product, because that's exactly what Google, etc. have done. They've made products. They're not the government. They're not media per se, but they also have a part to play in terms of contributing to that communication and healthy communication. I think.
Right, but in terms of regulation, I think it is at 2 levels.
Yes.
So you have the self-regulation aspect of it, where as a media house, maybe you, or as a body, a fraternity, you look at regulations.
Yes.
That,
That is
standards.
what I would prefer to push.
Yes, standards that are guiding the industry. And then we have regulations now from a legal standpoint.
Anya
Yes.
is there. Anya wants to
So,
make a contribution.
Yeah,
and we do have someone online, but I think I'd want to give Embert a chance to
Yes, I
frame the legal regulatory framework that is perhaps also needed.
Right. If my mask could come off, you'd have seen my smile when Glenn asked the question. But let's start off with this. I mean, we in a, as I said very early, we're in a free enterprise society. I mean, who is to tell you if I decide I want to set up a radio station, I can attempt to set up a radio station?
The market should decide.
Well, exactly. So there you and then you have, for instance, in the free enterprise, the regulatory mechanism is set up to provide this kind of, balance to assist that, to ensure that there's an even playing field for everyone. Obviously, if you lose, you have to get off the field. As a regulator, I would feel very happy because it means if everybody's paying their frequency authorization fees, I get more money. That translates, and for most people who do not know, most licensed service providers within our regulatory system ought to pay what you call a contribution to the Universal Service Fund. That fund in itself can go to further developing media to reach underserved populations and underserved areas. So there is some benefit in the multiplication of the media. But we know the reality, and clearly because of not necessarily because of capacity, but because of the constraints of the market and the volume of resources in our market, that is very difficult to sustain everyone at the same level. People think that most of these stations probably are running ahead. One, they don't pay the regulatory authority fees. Two, they do not contribute to intellectual property contributions. Like, I mean, you just use people's content and you do not compensate on that content. So there's a kind of a false sense of success of these. So clearly most of them, if you have to sort of go to the rules, they will be out of the picture from day one.
So if the free market system really works as it should, then it will take care of the numbers by themselves.
But mind you, if regulators have to intervene, they will drop out, because I'm sure regulators will make recommendations to whoever granted the license to revoke certain licenses for non-payment. But this is not being done because the media is a very sensitive case in that you cannot appear to interfere on the basis of trampling on one's freedom to speak or to express oneself and express messages. I find, again, people speak about self-regulation, which I find in the media context is really an oxymoron. I can't see self-regulation in an environment where you have 20 people. Who's going to jump out first?
Well, so the Media Association could have been playing a better role in that regard. So it's self-regulation is probably not.
Yeah. Well, we use the term co-regulation, which is technically different, where you allow the players in the market to work with the regulator to set up certain minimum standards that
practice and guidelines.
Well, yeah, to ensure that there's an even playing field,
Yes.
But Glenn, I think one of the things that is perhaps critical in terms of response to your question, the extent to which this proliferation of media is contributing to productivity in our society.
Right.
And then it is tied into a number of things. One, the media thrives on using content. If perchance you use 4 hours of content, whether it's local or regional, it means you're facilitating the growth of content. Are you paying for that content? If you pay for it, these people will be more productive. If you're not paying for it, you're really damaging that sector of our society, that sector of the productive sector of our society, because you're really stealing their stuff. And I think that is the kind of discussion we need to be having as well.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Embert. We do have a media owner who wants to make a contribution joining us online. Anya, the floor is yours. Thank you for your patience.
I think we're hearing Anya.
Is Anya with us? I can see that she is on mute her mic. Perhaps master control?
Yeah. There she is.
Oh, yes. Good afternoon, Anya. Thank you for
Good
joining
afternoon,
us.
everybody. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are. Thank you for joining us. You have a question or a response to Glenn's question? Yes.
All the responses so far have been on point, and I think as management of a media entity, I think it's important to recognize the role that media management have to play in the quality of media that exists now. We are not a very well connected media society. Media owners for years, we've been trying to get persons to come together to probably form a broadcasters association, and only at that point would the self-regulation come together. If media owners don't come together and agree that we need to do something to develop the quality of media, the quality of what comes out of media houses, then we're literally saying the regulators by default need to step in, and that is not the most favorable option to build a better quality media. You want that, Mr. Charles mentioned it, that co-regulation. You want the self-regulation as, not Glenn, who spoke first? Richmond.
Yeah.
Yes. You definitely want that self-regulation, but how do we even start the process of self-regulation if media owners do not come together and recognize, okay, we're getting to a point where it will no longer become sustainable. We need to come together to decide how does the future of media look in St. Lucia, what needs to be done, what standards and policies that we need to implement, what level do we need our journalists to start into the media as. You cannot start at an audit company without either a first degree or a professional certification. So, these are the types of conversations that media owners need to sit and start having in order to develop the media environment in St. Lucia. And self-regulation is not going to just appear out of nowhere. Media owners really need to come together to get that process going. Right. And this is therefore a call for media owners to, yes, we operate in a competitive space, but then we must recognize the disintegration of the quality of that competitive space if we are not going to come together and decide, what are the rules of the competition going to look like particularly in terms of standards and quality.
Right. Thank you so much, Anya, and thank you for the contribution and the call to action. We trust that other media owners are tuned in, and in fact, if they're not, this might be an opportunity for you to lead with such an initiative to bring the sector together and formalize things, which is not far-fetched because a lot of other sectors have been able to come together to form manufacturers association, farmers association,
vendors, taxi,
yes, vendors, taxi
teachers.
association. They all compete against each other, but they've managed to come together and agree on some minimum standards. And as she said, the rules for the games. I came across actually in my research in the UK, communicators have come together to determine what their practice and principles are. And they've come up with something called a modern operating model, a modern communication operating model that puts audience understanding at the heart of policy and service design. And that is what guides their work. And in there, they speak of continuous professional development so that they can remain world-class in the service that they do. Right? They speak of keeping up with technology, their strategies, how they are going to shape behavior, their mandate, which goes beyond just positioning brands and advertising. So it extends to a social developmental role and social developmental purpose. So thank you again, Anya.
I want to make a bold prediction.
Oh, certainly.
Just based on my observation of what is happening around the world. And we're going to speak a little out of COVID, but especially as it relates to media and the communication landscape around us. In the past 4 years or so, I have personally seen a lot of people we've heard about the cord cutters. I myself have been a cord cutter since 2008. But now you can literally set up a media house, a broadcasting house, without using spectrum,
Right.
without needing a broadcast license there. And the reality is now you see the radio stations now have a presence on social media, so they're using video as well as audio. The branding and advertising now is actually targeting such audiences, because typically you would have been just reliant on what you hear, but now they realize that you need to see, and there's valuable space there, and they're leveraging it in that
So they're now
direction.
audiovisual mediums.
They're now audiovisual. The
competing with
cord
the TV.
cutters are now using OTT over the top boxes there, so they're now not using a cable feed. And I know as well as an issue that in terms of the St. Lucian video operators, television stations have with one of the service providers, in terms of they have to pay to get their content out there, whereas the foreign content is being paid for.
Yeah.
So
Right.
the whole issue of sustainable development and survival is right there front and center there.
Right.
But here it is. We now need to show the audience that we have something that they need to come to. The offering has to be that advertising, in order now for the advertisers to recognize that they need to place their business and with you. And I think that is a challenge that I would like to offer my media colleagues there, that literally I can today open in my basement a whole TV station there, and I can talk to influencers, whether they are in St. Lucia or on the other side of the world, and this is the direction that we're going through. So in terms of your question, Glenn, that is my challenge I want to leave off today, in terms of this competitiveness and productivity, but sustainability in terms of how we go through the future.
Right, and you're talking about going forward.
Yes.
We need the roadmap for that.
Oh, the road, as Imbert
roadmap.
spoke about.
But as
yes.
Imbert said, we first need the roads.
You need the roads. You need to
We need the roads.
Yeah, you need to fix the roads, and I mean some of the roads that's clearly unfixed is the legislative environment under which we operate, and the relationships have to be fixed. I mean, I think simply Richmond spoke about the new modality of setting up a radio station or TV station online. I mean, once you're in the virtual platform, you can use both video as well as audio. But you're using someone's content to deliver audiences to advertisers.
You're monetizing other people's
You're
content.
monetizing people's content. You must pay the money.
Yes.
Otherwise, it will not be sustainable.
Excellent point.
Right. Now, with respect to the roadmap, help us to understand what a better environment would look like for communication and media in St. Lucia. If we were to be serious about setting up a roadmap, what would this roadmap look like, and what would be some of the main components of it?
If I may come in, because it will link with your question, but I really wanted to direct a question to
Okay,
Mr.
so we'll
Charles.
pause to allow for another question by Glenn.
Yes. So in line with what you're saying and what the roadmap, and as Mr. Charles has been saying, we need a road. Government media plays a significant role in terms of the communication environment. And right now, government media is even bigger than any one station put together. But the coordination of that media, I think, is lacking. And I think that there is a role for government media in everything. National disasters, creating an avenue to knock down disinformation and myths. But, Mr. Charles, how would you suggest a government better coordinates the level of media, the amount of media that it has, and media professionals that work within and across the various ministries? Because from where I stand, this is one of the things that could be more efficient in creating that roadmap. And government always creates the template that private sector normally will follow, because if government does it well, or whatever they implement, private sector tends to almost, in a sense, follow that in terms of even over time, everything that goes along with it. But government media at the moment is really disorganized, if I would say so personally. Charles, you as a former director, I know that you looked at the broader spectrum of information across government services. What would you suggest now in this modern day that government should really look at in order to boost its national profile, its imaging as well, because that's what we do as government media, and also to help with that roadmap that we want so much and so desperately to achieve?
And maybe to become a little more trusted?
Exactly, because with that would come trust, would come everything.
I'm sure you have the answer to your own question, but I'll give you my opinion anyway.
Well, I have ideas.
You have ideas, yeah, that's what I mean, because we all have ideas. I think there has to be the assumption that at a government level, what is necessary, that government has a role to play. I think in every society today, the most advanced societies of Europe and the UK still have what we call public communication spaces, in which government has a stake. This you have to separate from official government information. What you're talking about is coordinating the content mechanism of the government to go through that space. Now that space has to be shared with civil society, more or less a kind of independent space, and some countries have models where you have an independent media authority. So I think that has to be central. You don't compete with the private media, so the rules are very clear. And I think BBC UK is a good example. There's a regulator called Ofcom in the UK, the Office of Communication, which BBC has to submit its plans and budget to every year to ensure BBC doesn't compete unfairly with the private media. But BBC is allowed, even if its funding comes by and large from what you call a levy on providers, BBC is allowed to generate its own revenue through its own efforts. So what you find is happening, gradually the commitment and obligation of the public to fund it is slowly decreasing while its capacity is increasing. And then you have, at the same time, the private media is shielded from unfair competition by BBC because BBC is funded by public funds. So I think that has to be core. But at a broader level, we're talking about, and I think Richmond hinted to the use of ICT in that overall roadmap. What role does ICT play in the other sectors? Because content is being produced, everybody, I think O'Neill made the point, is now a publisher. Content is being produced by everyone who has access to a device. Your cell phone, you can create content on your cell phone. So we're not short of the capacity to create content and to fill in all of these media spaces. So you look at where government sits in that space, and then the role for the private. And then within the private media section, then we speak about the point Anya made earlier, that you have, coming together to see how best we can co-regulate and obviously bring up standards. Your standards would include training, for instance, your points of entry. What is the role of Sir Arthur Lewis in training our people right here? Other standards in terms, one of the things I find, especially with COVID, there are a lot of contradictions in the media. You find the Ministry of Health and even your organization has very cogent, professionally produced messaging. But 2 minutes of poor journalism in the same media house will just obliterate all that messaging. Some journalist who doesn't do their work properly writes a story like probably they think in an essay competition, doesn't verify their sources, undermines all the work you're doing. So the standards we're speaking about at a management level will be addressing some of these very issues.
Right. And just to pick up on what Embert said, at the government level, I did try to do some research in preparation for this to better understand how governments are harnessing the power of communication to help further their missions and their goals, right? And we found that in the UK, the occasion of COVID allowed the UK to scale up their communication. They now have a fully developed communication plan that they have published online, and it is across all sectors of government. Each sector is headed by a director of communication, and then that director is backstopped with a staff complement. And the idea is to use communication to underpin their Build Back Better campaign. Mm-hmm. This goes well beyond COVID. The communication plan allows them to put forward their brand promises as a government. This is what we are going to do. Our first priority is to support the NHS, right? That is a brand promise. And the fact that they have published it in their communication strategy now allows the public, ordinary people, to hold them to that. And they hold their communications team, right, to delivering the messaging around these promises. So I think it begins, Glenn, with first perhaps government, and when I say government, I'm speaking generic here, government acknowledging the role that communication plays, valuing communication. And I know that it's very hard to quantify that, you know, but when you have a reputational crisis, that involves legal fees and all of that because you miscommunicated or you didn't do it correctly or something, that is when you're able to value the benefits of proper communication. But an appreciation has to come first to value communication as a strategic management and leadership function, because that is where it has reached now.
But Glenn, just to add a small point there, the same regulator, and I suggest most people try to log on to Ofcom websites because there's a lot of valuable information about the significance of public media and public information. Mm-hmm. People in the UK still value BBC and public information sources as their credible sources of information on COVID. Very high.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much, Glenn. Now, if we can look at the connection between strategic communication and economic growth, how do we link these two things? At the business level, we can understand that very well. You use communication to deliver business goals, to help achieve business goals. But how do we do that now in a developmental context in the private sector, and how do we do it to get buy-in at a governmental level? Maybe, Loverly, you can add something to the contribution at this point from the OECS standpoint.
Okay, well, for me, I wanted to say something about the roadmap. I listened to Glenn's question, I listened to your response.
Sure.
And I heard a lot about communications and media. But I really want to go back to the responsibility of government to engage. And so in thinking of the roadmap, I really feel that your roadmap is your strategic engagement plan altogether. And developing that plan sometimes requires a pool of communications expertise. And a lot of that would be pulled from the media. And the involvement of stakeholders is crucial. And so developing that roadmap should involve a lot of engagement. One of the components of developing the roadmap is market research, especially if you're going to talk about economic development and how that ties in. And sometimes I think that aspect is overlooked. And I just wanted to bring that up. And it creates a situation of blind strategy based on assumptions, that misguides the entire communication approach. I had an experience while working in the statistical departments in the OECS member states conducting statistical assessments. It became apparent from the feedback of the public that they were aware of the census that was happening every 10 years. But they were not knowledgeable of the existence of the statistics department that was the key agency driving the census. For me at the time, that was a concern because that meant that the public may not have been able to understand the role of the census in influencing economic policy and how that affects their everyday lives in terms of where schools and health facilities are placed, etc. So in the roadmap for these units, it was important to redefine and strategically align the department as the driving force of the census and to provide guidance for policy development. Another point I would like to make about the roadmap is the need to continually review and sometimes recreate that roadmap based on the changing conditions within the environment. So it is important to remember that the roadmap can expire.
Indeed.
As the technology of communication advances. And it is also important to recognize that the global culture of communications is also rapidly being transformed. So all of that would affect the roadmap. I think these were the 2 points I really
Well, thank you, and very salient points, because the theme, I think, throughout is agility. Agility, innovation, and commitment to serve your audiences, because if you're committed to serve, you will then adapt to change, to reach them where they are, and with the right messaging. So how do we then connect these, the marketing research, the roadmap, the enabling legal environment? How do we harness all these things now to effect economic growth? Embert?
Yes, there has to be a connection, with the new technology. Because of the pervasiveness of broadband now in our society, although unfortunately we're still very low on the totem pole in St. Lucia. I'll probably pull up some data in a while, but for the last 4 years or so, the rate of growth of broadband penetration in St. Lucia has been very, very small. In fact, I think fixed broadband penetration has actually gone down, largely because, relative to the increase in households, you have very few people, more people are seeking mobile devices. And the challenges of getting productive mobile service, broadband services. Because look at what is happening with us today. You would have a broadband connection, and you have more speed, which allows you to consume than to share and distribute your content. That is the nature of the arrangements in most, because I guess the businesses are trying as much as possible.
So just for clarification, this relates to upload and download speed.
That's correct. It's called
we have more download capacity than upload capacity.
Right.
Okay.
That's what they call asynchronous broadband connection, where you would have much faster download speeds than upload speeds.
So we are consumers.
Yeah. So in a sense, you've been relegated to being consumers for the rest of your life, unless it is turned around to facilitate you being producers. Because a lot of the small startup businesses who want to sort of make their presence available, give them a break. Let them know that they have real-time speeds for uploading. But that's at the micro level. At the macro level as well, there has to be more investment in broadband penetration in our countries. I mean, the World Bank has done studies, the OECS has done studies, making a direct correlation between increase in broadband and increase in economic growth figures. So, as probably it's minuscule, I think you'd probably have, if you have an increase in broadband penetration over 1%, you may have a probably 0.7% increase in economic growth. But when you multiply that at the macro level, it makes a lot of sense. So I think that's, in terms of the relationship between our communication roadmap and economic growth, there is tested evidence already to show the relationship. But we have to fix the road.
We have to fix the road. And you
Yeah, but-
identified
but
some
ri-
points.
Yeah, I have exactly. I just find that some of our what is it policies, such as, for example, just the point that Imba just made. We recognize the challenges we have in reaching the last mile in terms of bringing broadband there. We recognize that. But looking at technologies available, even with the rollout of school right now, the Ministry of Education is giving hotspots to households that do not have that level of connectivity. It tells me, on the other hand, that connectivity over LTE, over cellular, is there to help augment that. But here you have that when you look at what a mobile device, a telephone specifically, is taxed in terms of importation vis-a-vis what a computer is taxed, I am asking myself, why are we taxing phones? Because we see phones as a consummation or consuming media or tool. But really and truly, you can follow a virtual meeting, and many are, even in this case, over their mobile devices. I know a lot of the school the students right now, Natalie, are connecting via a mobile device, a phone, because you would hear that it's given some problems on Google Classroom and etc. But you can try this and that. I am just saying that let's open up for the phones there, and let us encourage the change in behavior to be not consuming but producing, that you can use. You go out to the church services there and you see people streaming our church service with a phone. You see people, I think, can use these devices, given especially where we are and where we're going even after the pandemic, to offer their wares now to the world, such as a QVC, a home shopping network kind of thing, that we're in the month of October where people are wearing the madras and whatnot. Let us tie that with the delivery services that are now evolving and going up the place, that, yeah, you can buy yours now. And even like Amazon is doing doing deliveries in 1 hour of your order. Why can't I order a breadfruit and saltfish from whoever there, down the road, on Journée Creole Day, and we all stay safely, social distance with our families and immediate people nice there, and have a full experience there because of the reality of where we are, not just for this time, but for the time going forward. These are the things I think in terms of the sustainability and the roadmap that we, it's more calls for the strategies to inform the tactics, just on your buzzwords that you put there, and being innovative and really looking for these opportunities there. I don't think we're doing that enough. There's tremendous opportunity for where we are, and I think it's a golden opportunity where we can really become competitive and take this out going forward.
It speaks, Richmond, to understanding, again, going back to Glenn's point about the relationship, to breaking these silos, because whereas you have the champions in ICT and the use of ICT for development are saying, make sure that you're able, that ICTs are accessible, but then you have, on the other hand, people who are tasked with the responsibility of making revenue for government will go to these areas which have what we call the inelastic demand. People will buy phones anyway, so let's tax it.
And they will get them in anyway.
You'll get them anyway, so let's tax it, because the money must come in. So there has to be that relationship between the two to ensure that we have economic growth. There is this short-term vision that let's milk as much as possible without looking at the long-term vision, because you milk the cow now and you kill the cow.
Right.
But if you manage the cow differently, you'll have the cow for a few more years.
Exactly.
So what I'm hearing is a call to recategorize the cell phone as an essential device for these times, as opposed to a luxury item.
Certainly.
Yeah,
Yes?
I use it as one example, but in terms of these examples are everywhere. We're saying even in terms of getting the messages out, I see so many missed opportunities.
Right.
For example, the people who are lined up along the banks waiting for the new card, there are messages that you can get on a billboard, on somebody who can walk across the street from a government agency and give some understanding of the measures that we don't have to depend totally on the internet to get this, but recognizing again that not everybody is connected, but we have been provided all of these opportunities for the other techniques, the face-to-face in a safe way, your mask on, social distance and whatnot, and you literally have a captive audience on the sidewalk there who is, they don't have anywhere else to go, you know.
Right.
So they might as well listen to what you have to tell them in terms of strengthening the immune system,
Right.
doing
So
the
there are
protocols
gaps.
and everything
There are
else.
gaps
There are
and there
gaps.
are opportunities
Yeah.
for us to fill those gaps and to become more effective at our communication. Natalie, how is it that the community college can facilitate the outcome of economic growth using communication? How do you think you can better or enhance that process, that cycle?
I think in many ways we have already started doing that, but let me just say, when we speak of the roadmap, I think it really has to be tied into national goals. I'm not sure if we have this
National goals?
goals, because you
Goals,
talk about business
exactly.
goals.
Right.
So there has to be this sort of broader strategic plan, a national strategic plan that everybody feeds from, including the college, who's responsible for training.
Right.
So definitely, and let me just throw an example in. We are now doing a project with an institution called SAGE that is Canadian-based. And they're saying that the programs that we are going to offer, that they are devising, which has to do with climate change, we must target vulnerable populations. And now I have to create a marketing communications plan that speaks to how I'm going to reach those vulnerable populations. Yes? Women, youth. So we have several projects that are doing that. So if the government has this overall plan that says this is what we want to accomplish to achieve our economic outcomes, then definitely all of our agencies, our NGOs, our quasi-government organizations, our educational
Are now
institutions
aligned.
will be aligned, and the
Will be aligned.
communication will fall in line with that.
Right, because as I mentioned in the example of the UK government, they have not only come up with their communication plan, they've published it. And it's
Exactly.
now being held as a brand promise.
Yes.
These are our goals, and this is how we're going to be building back better, and this is how we're doing it in every single sector. Yes?
I don't know if Embert or Richmond or Glenn can speak to this vision commission that we had at one point. And I thought that's where we were heading at some point. That the nation would know what our vision is for the future, and therefore we can map out how are we going to get there. And like I said, everything will fall in line. Where did that go?
Yeah, we're very good at that during campaign season. You know, we get a manifesto that states our mission and vision, but at a governmental level, do we have that? Do we understand what the mission is?
There are several documents that speak to vision and mission at different times in our history. Because of the level at which these have been pitched, and some of them have become reports in various ministries, they haven't become popular documents that people are engaged in. And if people simply had copies of these documents, they could remind policymakers occasionally, you know, I have this because I came to a meeting, you know, in a little tout coin bougie, c'est que monter là, monter faire contribution moi.
So there was no
Qui ça
communication
fait?
plan, Embert.
Pardon?
There was no communication plan. So we did that vision, but who was it communicated to? And
Right.
what was the communication plan for that?
To support
Yeah,
that
but
vision.
I wouldn't necessarily knock the idea
Oh, not.
because
No, we're not
again,
knocking the idea.
development, as I said, the policies you've looked at, O'Neill, and I think Glenn mentioned earlier, are good because you need at least a roadmap, a plan for a specific period. I think Lovely said for a specific period because it has to be renewed from time to
must
time.
communicate it.
So where are we heading within the next, even more than 10 years, kind of thing? And then it's broken up into smaller segments that says, okay, this is the strategy we have between the first 5 years, the next, and whatnot.
Right.
I think we need these things so that we move to the same idea, and especially where you have change of government so often, that it
Right.
is not
Vision
just
remains.
based on one campaign manifesto and then this
Right.
starts and then this
The
gets
vision
stopped
remains.
after. The vision remains. Okay, we might disagree how we get there, but we all put our effort towards the same objective. I think
Right.
that's where it's really at there.
And I agree. And we're running out of time now, so I would be forced to ask every one of you to give a small statement as we wrap up. But just to say, in terms of the roadmap, in terms of what I can envision, not that I'm a policymaker, I have any power to effect it, but as you said, there's a 5-year plan, but there's a communication strategy that is renewed every year, because the situation is so fast changing. All right? At a fundamental level, you know what you want to reach, what you want to do, but you have to renew your tactics and your strategies to suit the changing tides of our society, of technology, and everything else that exists in the ecosystem of existing. Right? So as we close up, the floor is yours individually to make any closing remarks and to highlight anything that you perhaps have not had the opportunity to do in the course of this discussion. And I will start with Loverly.
Thank you, Onel. I'm just going to point out an initiative that the OECS Commission is undertaking to nurture our youth in this area of communications. Because if you're talking about the future of communications, the best persons or the best people to understand the future today are our youth. Because they are the ones advancing the technology and creating the new forms of communications that many of us don't even quite understand. So in June 2020, as an extension of the OECS Youth Empowerment Strategy, and in a response to the challenges of continuity that the COVID-19 pandemic created, the OECS Economic Development Management Unit launched a regional OECS Yes I News broadcast.
Right.
And this initiative is first and foremost about giving voice and expression to students. It is done in collaboration with the Ministries of Education across the region, and it is intended to provide students with an opportunity for creative expression and skill development. The broadcast integrally involves students in the process, particularly with the reporting activities as they acquire a range of interviewing, writing, and speaking skills. Teachers, of course, took the lead in preparing the students to fully participate in the production. In Grenada, the engagement went to another level, where the Minister of Education, Honorable Emmeline Pierre, recruited these same students to host and present the national news. So we recognize these experiences as critical interventions at this time to promote the importance of communications and to engage the youth on the production front.
Thank you, and that's important, because we need a recruitment source. And if we're talking about scaling up and improving the media sector and having minimum standards, then ensuring that we have a population that is so nurtured is very much important. Embert?
Well, I think we have lots of tools already available that we have to put into effect. We didn't speak about the electronic communication bill for the OECS, which has already been passed by St. Kitts, and which addresses a number of issues for the new electronic communications technology. Particularly, it refers to consumer protection, quality of service, and the developmental role of ICT, both at a national as well as a regional level, in creating what you call a single space within the Caribbean region. I think, I want to leave with a last point, that there has to be a national statement that everybody buys into, and then following that, you'll have the respective roles and responsibilities, whether it is at a public sector level or at a private sector level.
Thank you, Embert. Richmond?
Richie is fine. I love Richie. For me, I would just like to be the voice in the room that says that there have been a lot of very good contributions this week. I followed not all of them, but most of them, and I heard lots of ideas. We St. Lucians can talk so much and talk a good talk. What I hope coming that it's collated and there is action. I'm a hands-on person myself. I see some of these opportunities. I recently, in the recent months, decided to step out of my comfort zone to try to take advantage of them, so that we can really take our country to the next level. I mentioned a few of my ideas during the course of the discussion in terms of the missed opportunities I see that there are, and for my part, I intend to tap into them with your help, of course. That's it for me.
And Natalie.
For us at the South Louis Community College, I think we are poised to be part of that roadmap. We can use the communication tools to prioritize what is important to the nation for us to fulfill those national goals that I think that are key to really designing that roadmap. And we have already begun with our digital literacy. We have been training educators so that they can train our students. And we really look forward to all of the entities coming together so that we can really create that roadmap that will lead to economic growth.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for your time, your professional time and talent, and for sharing with us this afternoon, both the live and the virtual audience. In closing, I would just like to say that, you know, COVID-19 has presented a lot of uncertainty, and this uncertainty is weighing heavily on the minds of businesses, not just here, but globally. And I think that this presents a real opportunity for communicators, marketeers to demonstrate their value in driving critical growth and keeping brands' engagement with customers. It is a time, I think, for less fluff and more meat. And as Embert said, really take our place as developmental partners and not just about finding an audience to sell something, because there's a whole world to educate, there's a whole world to inform, and there's a whole world to engage with. And it's, you know, there are many opportunities that are presented within that sphere. I'm Onel Sanford Bell. It has been a pleasure being your moderator this afternoon. Thanks to the National Productivity Council, yes, for inviting me to be a part of this process. We also would like to thank those of you who have taken the time to join us online and to be with us here this afternoon. Stay well, stay safe, and be good to yourselves.